Hello. So in this video, I want to talk about the moral or ethical theory known as virtue ethics. So I'll start with a brief overview of the theory. So according to virtue ethics, morality is most fundamentally concerned with the development of good character traits. And we'll talk later in this video about what exactly that means. That's a basic idea behind the theory. And often, virtue ethics is understood as an objectivist theory of morality. That is, ethicists often think that it's an objective fact about the world that the person with good character traits or virtues is a good person, whereas someone who lacks these good character traits is bad, independently of what we might personally think or believe about that. Not subjective, according to many, if not most, versions or proponents of the theory. And it might be worth noting here that virtue ethics traces back at least to ancient Greek philosophy, where one of its most famous defenders was Aristotle. And in this video, my explanation of virtue ethics will appeal to Aristotle's own version of the theory. So, okay, brief overview on the table. Let's start with that now. So, central to Aristotle's way of working out virtue ethics is his notion of happiness. According to Aristotle, the supreme good for human beings is happiness. Um, and according to Aristotle as well, happiness is achieved through the conjunction of the following three things. So we have performing our function well, and at least some external goods. Now, it's worth noting here, in fact, it's really important to note that what Aristotle means by happiness is something really specific, as we can see maybe by what he thinks is required to achieve happiness. And this might come apart from contemporary ways of understanding happiness. We might think that, well, in ordinary non-philosophical context, when we talk about whether someone is happy or not, we might just tend to reflect on whether or not we think that they feel good or not. And in line maybe with certain contemporary ethical or moral theories, which also rely on a notion of happiness. One popular way of understanding happiness is to identify it with pleasure, but that's very much not what Aristotle has in mind here, given that this performance of one's function and performance of it well are required necessary parts of his picture of happiness. We can see this maybe how this notion of happiness and some others, maybe our own, come apart from Aristotle's notion by reflecting on this point, which is that if someone got maximal pleasure, if they felt like really happy and pleased all the time, but they were neglecting their function, or they got this pleasure from neglecting their function, or even neglecting to perform it well, Aristotle would say that they're not truly happy. So that hopefully helps illustrate how these two notions of happiness, or Aristotle's notion of happiness and maybe a variety of our contemporary notions, could come apart. Um, and it's worth saying here, related to all of this, that Aristotle was writing in Greek, and the term that he used that is translated as happiness is eudaimonia. Because of this fact that Aristotle's notion of happiness differs from the utilitarian notion, which is that of, at least most straightforwardly or most commonly, identifying happiness with pleasure, and maybe from other contemporary notions as well, perhaps somewhat from our colloquial notion too. Some scholars suggest translating eudaimonia as flourishing instead of happiness. So that's all worth keeping in mind. I think ultimately it doesn't matter too much what term we use here, so long as like we're clear that, well, whether we call it happiness or flourishing, insofar as we're talking about this in the context of Aristotle and virtue ethics, what we mean is something very specific, which may differ from what other theories such as utilitarianism and maybe speakers in colloquial contexts tend to have in mind. Okay, so it's noted in Aristotle's definition of happiness that part of what makes someone happy, he thinks, is performing their function and doing so well. To know what that really means, we might need to ask, well, what is the function of a human being in the first place? Well, we can think of something's function as being that which the thing aims at. And in other words, we might think that something's function is, in a sense, its purpose. It's that which it is directed towards. Um, so according to Aristotle, our function, or the thing that we aim at, is rational, what he calls rational activity of the soul. Um, Now, one thing to note here is that there's much debate in philosophy about how we should think about the soul, whether such a thing exists, etc. Um, and these questions are definitely relevant for a deep understanding of Aristotle's thought. However, for our purposes in this video, and really plausibly for just a general understanding of virtue ethics without diving too deep into some specific points, we can just think of the soul as referring to the mind. So we could just replace this with um, the claim that our function is a rational activity of the mind. Um, why not think that our function is something else? Why is this what he assumes that our function is? Well, Aristotle thinks that our function should be something unique to the sort of things that we are. What we aim at is part of what distinguishes us from other sort of beings. So we might have other contenders for what our function could be, but Aristotle thinks that they're shared with other sort of beings. So for example, we might think that our function could be nutrition or survival. But here's the problem with that. We share this with plants and animals. So it's not unique to us. It's not unique to the sort of things that we are. So Aristotle thinks that this cannot be our function. Uh, Another option might be that, well, our function is to be sentient or have consciousness or have perception, or to perform certain acts of sentience or consciousness or perception. But again, Aristotle thinks that, well, the problem here is that this is not unique to us, not even unique to us as like a general um, species or the sort of things that we are, because we share this with at least some animals. So what is unique to us, he thinks? Well, rational activity. So that has to be our function. So, okay, hopefully that gives us at the very least, a vague picture of what Aristotle thinks that our function is. We haven't yet said how the notion of virtue or good character traits fits in here, but we can start bringing that in now. So, broadly speaking, the virtues corresponding to some type of thing are the traits or characteristics that that type of thing needs to perform its function well. So this means that the virtues for a human being are those traits or characteristics that a human being needs to perform their function well. Um, and since performing our function well is a necessary condition of happiness, on Aristotle's view, we therefore need certain virtues in order to reach happiness. So that is how the virtues sort of fit into the picture here. Happiness, on Aristotle's view, is the supreme good for us. What we need to get happiness, at least in part, is to perform our function well. And what do we need to perform our function well? Well, we need certain traits or characteristics that allow us to do that, and those are the virtues. Um, but even with that said, the notion of a virtue itself might be kind of vague. What specifically are these virtues that we're talking about? All we've said are that they're the traits or characteristics broadly construed that allow us to perform our function well. Um, One thing to note about them is that Aristotle thinks that they're dispositions that lead to us regularly doing good things. So the virtues are something that we foster over time and sort of internalize as dispositions. They're not simply rules that like we rationally like reflect on and follow in like one instance and then that's it. Even if we continue to apply them in each instance where such a rule could apply, instead, by habitually doing things in a certain way, we sort of foster and develop these dispositions, which then um, lead us to act in a way that's regularly good, sort of naturally. So that's one thing to note about them. Also, importantly, these are not personality traits of the sort that might be determined by someone's genetics either. So while they're not things that we just like rationally reflect on and immediately choose to follow, like in one instance, and then that's it, we're virtuous. They're also not things that are sort of like determined by one's genetics where they can't be changed. They can be changed and fostered, but they're the sort of traits that we can develop and foster over time through learning and habit. So again, we can't just immediately become virtuous by choosing to follow a certain set of rules, but we also are not stuck one way forever. We can habitually form ourselves into a virtuous or good person. Okay, so still, probably more to be said in terms of giving us a picture of what the virtues are supposed to look like. So we've said that they're dispositions. But another thing to bring in here on Aristotle's view is that the moral virtues for human beings are means between two vices, where vices are, unlike virtues, which are assumed to be good character traits, vices are bad character traits. And so moral virtues, Aristotle thinks, are means between two vices, where one of these vices is of excess and the other is of deficiency. Yeah, so whereas a virtue is a good character trait, a vice is a bad one. So Aristotle thinks that each good character trait falls in between two bad ones, one of excess and one of deficiency. Here are some examples. So we have courage, friendliness, and truthfulness, all of which are virtues, but they can fall in between two extremes. If you're courageous, it's good to be courageous. It's a good character trait. But of course, if you had an excess, if you were just jumping into dangerous situations, throwing yourself in harm's way without good reason, that would be too much. That wouldn't be good. It would no longer be a good character trait. So you wouldn't really have courage. You would now be leaning into the side of having a vice. On the other hand, if you didn't have enough courage, you were too cowardly to do anything when it needed, even when it really needed to be done, too scared, such that like you gave into your fear and weren't willing to put yourself out there, even in important situations. That wouldn't be good either. You'd be deficient in courage. We can go through other examples. There are much more than could be provided here, but I guess to focus on one other here with truthfulness, one example popularly given is that, okay, so it's good, it seems good in general to be truthful, honest, but you can be too truthful and too honest. Suppose, for example, that your grandma gives you knits you a sweater for Christmas. You really don't like it. She asks you what you think about it. You say, "Oh, this is such an ugly and horrible sweater." Well, we might think that seems rather mean, inconsiderate, not a good character trait to have if you're the sort of person who would say stuff like that whenever you feel that way or it comes to mind. So really, like being truthful falls below that in terms of like how willing you are to just say whatever you think or feel about things. The person who's really virtuous, who has what we might regard the good trait of truthfulness, isn't just saying any sort of needlessly hurtful thing in that sort of way. At the same time, someone who constantly lies for their own benefit, um, we might think is intuitively not a great person. Most people tend to think that that sort of thing isn't great. So truthfulness, insofar as it's a virtue, might also seem plausibly to fall in between two extremes, or one is of excess and one is of deficiency. Okay, so now we might have a general picture of what virtue ethics is. Again, something might be kind of vague, but hopefully that helps at least provide us somewhat with a picture of what the theory says, how the virtues fit in, why Aristotle thinks that they're important. But we might say, well, okay, we've gotten the picture now, at least a vague version of it. But why should we accept virtue ethics as a plausible or correct ethical theory? Well, one argument that might be provided for it is based on functions. So, premise one, human beings have a function. Premise two, if human beings have a function, then a good human being is one who performs their function well. Therefore, from 1 and 2, a good human being is one who performs their function well. So the next slide, I'm going to focus on premise 1, evaluating whether there's good reason to accept that or not. But briefly, before we move to that, we might ask, well, what would be the motivation for premise 2 here? One motivation is that, okay, if we look back at what was said earlier, if something has a function, one way of understanding this is to say that, well, that thing has a purpose or a goal that it is like directed at or aims at. So if that's the case, then if human beings have a function, they have some purpose or goal that they're directed towards. If something, including a human being, really has a purpose or goal that it's directed towards, then it seems like, well, good version of that sort of thing, including a human being, would be one that performs that function well. That is, that um, pursues or reaches that goal well. So that's a general thought in terms of how we might motivate premise two. But we might ask, well, why should we assume that we really do have a function in the first place? Here's one argument for the conclusion that we do. So premise one, our organs have a function. For example, the eye's function is to see, the stomach's function is to digest food, etc. Um, premise two, if our organs have functions, then our best explanation of things is to assume that we have a function too. Um, one reason for thinking that might be that, well, you know, our organs, one way to make sense of the sort of things that they are is how they fit in as part of the overall organism. If all of the organs have a function, then on the one hand, it might seem like, well, so insofar as they fit into one organism, maybe that organism would seem to have a function as well. Another way of maybe going about motivating this slightly different would be to say that, well, okay, so our organs, in some way, we make sense of their function in reference to the organism that they help perform its broader function. So the eye's function is to see, we might say, but the eyes themselves, at least on many views, don't themselves see. They perform this function for the organism. It's the human or the animal that sees, not the eyes on their own. Um, but if we have to make sense of the functions of the organs themselves by fitting them into the role that they play in the overall organism, maybe we're thinking one way or another, like either the best way to do this or the only plausible way to do this would be in reference to the function that the organism as a whole plays itself. And therefore, from 1 and 2, if these two premises are correct, then we have a function 2. Okay, so that's one potential motivation, one argument for thinking that we have a function. But there might be more to be said here. Potentially, some doubts that could have implications both on premise 1 and 2 in this argument. Though in my discussion here, I might focus a little more on premise 1, that is the claim that our organs have functions. So, let's just start with the general question. Like, should we really think that human beings have a function? Should we even think, we might wonder, whether our organs have a function in the first place? One motivation for thinking that they do, that our organs at least have a function, that might just seem intuitive, that they're sort of directed at this. That the eye, for example, is directed at the aim or goal of seeing. But there might be ways to doubt this. We might think that the eye could perform this function in a sense without having this function. And the distinction here on first glance might seem a bit unclear, but let's spell out the way that this could sort of be set apart. That is how we could set apart the idea of performing a function and having a function. So perhaps we might think the eye performs the function of seeing, but the eye does this simply because organisms that had eye-like organs in history um, that did this, that is, that performed the function of being able to see, were able to survive and reproduce better than organisms that had eye-like organs that did not perform this function. That is, that did not allow an organism to see. But we might be able to say all of this and explain why there are eyes and why they perform this function without supposing that the eye itself has a purpose or is directed at a goal. In other words, we might think that, well, sure, the eye does something. In a sense, it performs a function. It allows us to see. There's something that it can be used to do. But nevertheless, we can explain all of this merely by appealing to what organs and what in light of what they were able to do, were beneficial for an organism's survival, and what organs weren't, or at least were less beneficial. Um, and it's not clear anywhere in this picture that we need to appeal to the eye itself having a purpose or being directed at a goal. Um, so the distinction that we might make here between performing a function and having a function would be to say that something performing a function is just to say that it does that thing. The function that it does, that it performs, sorry, not that it has, that it performs is something that it does. But having a function means that there's something like central to its nature where it doesn't merely do that thing. Its purpose or goal or aim is of either doing that thing or producing the output of doing that thing. And so that would be the sort of distinction here, where maybe we could say that, well, even if our organs perform a function, this doesn't require us to think that they have them in the sense of themselves being directed at an aim or a goal. That all being said, there might be arguments for virtue ethics that do not appeal or rely that do not appeal to or rely on the notion of functions. And I want to briefly go over one here before closing. So, premise one, there are certain standards that anything must meet in order to qualify as a human being, and things can meet these standards to varying degrees. So the motivation for this might be that, well, okay, there's certain things that have to be true about some organism or some being in order for it to count as a human. Um, if we took a fish, for example, we might say, well, it doesn't meet the necessary standards for counting as a human being. For one, it's not a mammal. Maybe for two, it doesn't have the sort of brain function that we might think is sort of constitutive of the nature of human beings. There might be all sorts of things we could say here. Two, if there are certain standards that anything must meet in order to qualify as a human being, and things can meet these standards to varying degrees, then a good human being is one who meets these standards to a high degree. The motivation for this would be, um, well, to start with sort of a vague motivation, we might say, like, well, okay, there are certain things that have to be true about some organism or some being in general for it to count as a human being. Um, but if this is so, then it might seem plausible just from that so long as something meets these standards better, like to the um, highest degree that it's able to meet these standards, it counts as a better human being. Um, but maybe that doesn't seem intuitive so far. And one way of maybe trying to provide some additional motivation for this premise would be to appeal to certain analogies. So we might say that, okay, so imagine that there's certain standards that something has to meet in order to count as a pencil. One might be that it has to be able to write. Maybe another is that it has an eraser. Maybe not. We might think that that's not necessary. But let's suppose that both are necessary conditions for something being a pencil. But I might have two pencils. One that writes really well, has a great eraser, I can erase things really smoothly. One that really does not write well at all. It also doesn't erase things well. And I might say that because it does write and it does erase things, it meets the standards necessary to qualify as a pencil. But it's not really a good pencil because it meets these standards to a pretty low degree. It just passes the threshold needed to count as a pencil in the first place, but not but it doesn't really exemplify these standards to a high enough degree to count as a good pencil. Whereas the pencil that writes really well, has a really nice eraser that works really well, that seems to meet the standards in a way that allows it to count as a really good pencil. And so we might think that, well, okay, this seems like a normal way of evaluating things in other cases. So by analogy, one might think that it applies here as well. That could be another way of trying to motivate the second premise. And then just tying these together, therefore, this should be from 1 and 2. A good human being is one who meets these standards to a high degree. Okay, so that wraps up the general like overview and sort of picture of virtue ethics that I wanted to provide in this video. So I hope this has been helpful.